This is what you'll learn how to make today. Orsen is a progressive house and deep house producer, owner and manager of Replug Records alongside Cid Inc, another artist I covered in another video. But this video is all about Orsen. Orsen tends to dabble in a lot of different styles and all are equally just as good while maintaining top-notch quality across all of his releases. We're gonna jump into the video. Before we do, make sure to hit subscribe so you get more videos like this one. If you wanna download the project files, click in the link in the description below. You'll get access to the samples, the presets, everything used in this video. Let's get started. The key of the track is F minor. The BPM is 122 beats per minute. And I'm going to start with the kick drum first. It's going to be very simple. I just want to choose a punchy kick drum. With Orsen's style, his kick and bass are tight together. The kick isn't as maybe loud as other styles or genres. It still packs a punch, but it's not the main focus of the track, which gives it more of a rolling energy. But the kick still punches through. So let's grab this kick drum here. And I'm going to just check this kick drum. I'm going to choose one that's nice and punchy already. It's punchy, but it could be a little bit punchier. I want to tune the kick drum, so I've actually transposed this up to an F from an E. So one semitone brings it from E to F. And then I'm going to add some EQ. And I would add some compression to make it a bit punchier, but I can see in the transient in the waveform that it is already fairly punchy right here. We can see that the bass goes a little bit louder right at the beginning. And I know that's going to add a nice punch to that kick because it's right at the beginning. So I don't really need to compress anymore, but I do want to grab this frequency around here and I push this up a little bit. It's going to sound just a little bit punchier. You can hear that that's kind of that knocking sound that we get with the kicks. And right at the F there, I can push that up a little bit. It's very subtle, but it's just going to add a little bit more punch. And then I'm going to go to the octave of that. So that is at 85 Hertz. So let's go to this next one here and we'll do 170 Hertz. Quick maths. And I'll make this pretty narrow. That kind of bonginess. I'm just pushing that up just a little bit. Just makes it punch a little bit harder. And then I'm going to grab probably my favorite tool is the drum bus. Already add some punch, already add some weight, but I don't want this at 100% dry wet. I'm just gonna bring this down. Maybe push the transients up a little bit, just a very little bit. Dampening up all the way and drive down a little bit. Yeah, that's a nice punchy kick. Cool, let's move on to the bass. Orsen's bass lines usually have a bit of movement to them and they're usually a little bit complex, but they're always groovy. And usually there's a couple different layers in that bass line to give it that essence of movement and groove. So I added 3 layers to the bass here. The first layer is going to be the main groove, the main bass line. And this is the MIDI for it. I chose really fast, kind of punchy bass notes here because in a lot of Orsen's tracks, I found that he would use these quick stabby type basses to keep the energy going. I'm going to use a wavetable and I'm going to put this up to a sawtooth wave so we get the sub frequencies and some of the higher frequencies to make it more like a pluck. And then I'll push this down 1 octave, 12 semitones. And let's hear how it sounds with the filter down a little bit. I'll change the filter to 24. I want to bring this down pretty far, almost all the way. Let's go down to about 40. Maybe a little higher. So I can hear those bass frequencies coming through. I'll push the sustain all the way up on the amplitude. And then I'm going to push envelope 2, sustain all the way down. And then the matrix, I'm going to push the frequency 2 filter up on envelope 2. So we're going to make a pluck here. But I want it to be a bass pluck. I want just a little bit of harmonics to come through, but I don't want it to be a main type of pluck where we can really hear, I just stubbed my toe. Ouch. I want it to be just a pluck that has some warmth and some punch without actually pulling away too much of the higher frequencies. It'll be kind of distracting that way. Nice. So I'll go back to the MIDI, and if you take a look over here, there is actually a little bit of a drop of velocity here. And the reason for that is I want to change this bass line a little bit already. I want to have a little bit more movement so it's not so stagnant and repetitive. I can go into the actual wavetable here and I can click MIDI. And right now we have velocity at 50 on the amplitude. So that means that the velocity will change the amplitude by about 50% of the actual velocity range, or that number. So if the velocity is at 100, it will change it about 50% of that. But I'm just going to base it off my ear. So I'm going to actually change the filter as well. So I'll push the filter up a little bit. So what's going to happen is when the velocity is higher, like on these notes, the filter will be more open. And when it's lower on this note, it'll be closed. You can see that there's a little bit of velocity difference in all these notes. So that lower velocity note is a little bit quieter and the cutoff is a little bit closed more on the filter. It gives just a bit of variation to that bass line right away. Last, I'll add an LFO onto the matrix for the cutoff. So I'll bring this amount down quite a bit. Make sure I turn the retrigger off, that's important. Otherwise, every note will just start right back here. In the matrix, frequency, and I will change LFO 1 filter frequency. If I push up a lot, you'll really hear what's going on. It's following that path. But I just want to add a little bit to give us some variation to the bass. Cool, now this bass has quite a bit of movement on it, but it's very subtle. It's groovy and it's catchy. It makes you want to tap your toe, bob your head, and that's what we want out of a bass line. I'll pull down the frequency just a little bit more because I'm going to have a lot of high energy, high frequency stuff in the track, so I don't want too much of that high end kind of bleeding through. But I do have that nice movement. So I want to add maybe a little bit of saturation. I'll use an overdrive so I can just grab just the high end and just very, very light. Cool, that sounds good. Some EQ. Filter at the very, very low end that I don't need. And maybe pull this down a little bit. Make sure that we are in mono for our bass. Which sounds like we are. Yeah, we are, but just in case. And last but not least, a sidechain compressor on the end of the channel. So sidechain from the kick. And I want to get a decent amount of sidechain going on here. And let's take a listen with the kick. It's sounding really good so far. So I'm going to add a second channel of bass here. So I'll duplicate this first channel. I'm going to duplicate everything over into the second channel. So grab everything and just duplicate that into the second channel. And if I look at the MIDI here, again, I'm just keeping things interesting, hooky, catchy, very simple. Let's take a listen to that. So it's just F on the low and on the high, but I don't want that low end, so I'm gonna cut all that out. And I'll pull up that high end a little bit. And I wanna make this a little bit more interesting, a little bit higher of a sound, so I'm going to put some unison on it, but I have to be careful because low end instruments with unison are going to have a lot of stereo width. So I'll push the unison up a little bit. And I get that really cool, gritty kind of sound. I'm going to take the LFO off. I don't want movement on this sound. I want it more of a pluck. So I'll take the LFO off. I'll take the overdrive off. I'm going to have this nice constant pluck. Maybe I'll turn this up a few decibels. I can see that I'm hitting the same notes as here, and I know that I have bass there, so I'm going to cut out a little bit more bass. Or actually, maybe I can change this filter. Cut out a little bit more. So I want this to be like an accent. There's a different sound that's going to be different than the actual bass, and it's just going to keep that bass interesting and keep it very moving and different. Something I wanted to mention is that you should always be trying to create your own style and not just directly copying from other artists. This video is just educational so that you can learn how to write in this type of way so that you can hopefully put that towards your own music. Third layer of bass, I have this quick MIDI here. Just another accent to keep it moving and keep it interesting. Again, just simple hooks. And I'm going to just duplicate again this whole channel onto here. And I'll just take the MIDI from this one and put it over. So now this is the third one. And I'm going to just, right, it's the same simple thing, just a simple pluck. But this time I'm going to change this down here. So this is going to go from none to FM. And I'm going to increase the tuning of the FM and the amount. So first I'll do the amount. Doesn't sound too different, but once I change this tuning, it's going to sound pretty different. I'm looking for a tuning that sounds pretty close to mine. Right about there. Maybe push the amount up a little bit more. Maybe I can add just a little bit of reverb onto there, just a tiny, tiny bit. Make sure my mono and my compressor's on. Actually, I'll leave this one not mono, this second bass. The third bass, I will also not leave mono, but I'm going to add some mid-side EQ. I'm going to do that after the reverb. So the reverb is going to add some stereo imaging to the sound. So I want to just make sure that I'm pulling out anything from the low end. So first I'll do the reverb, just to give it a little bit of movement, a little bit of life. And then I'll use a mid-side EQ. So change this mode to mid-side, change it to side, and we can see all this low end we don't want in the sides of our image, so I'll just cut that out. Let me push up this high end a bit. And last but not least, of course, sidechain compression, if it even hits the same time as the kick, which I don't think it really will. And let's listen to all three of the basses now. I'll group these together, throw a compressor on there. Whoops. Bass. I'm going to compress all the bass together just a little bit. Slower attack. Just a little bit of glue together. Turn down the space a little bit. And now I have this full gritty bass line with a couple different layers. It's catchy, it's hooky, it's groovy, and it sounds powerful and warm. And I'll add just a little bit more sidechain compression after the other compressor, just to make sure we're really pushing through all of those elements. All right, let's move on to the drums and percussion. Orsen style of drums are crispy top end. There's a lot of movement. There's usually one or two percussive elements that are very catchy and hooky, but it's not overly aggressive. Usually he uses tighter sounding drums for the top end, which is a nice contrast to the energy that usually the synths and the bass come to play. First, I have this percussion, and it's just to get a groove going, a nice hook going, and it complements the overall drum loop. So it's just a simple tom. I've dipped down the velocity just a little bit here on this note, but the main idea is that it's catchy. So if I listen with the metronome, it's catchy and groovy, so I want to make sure I have at least one of these percussion sounds that are going to keep that groove going. Just used a simple tom here. You can use any tom, but I like this one because it's very clean and it's tonal. It carries a nice clean pitch. If I check with a tuner here, I can see that it was actually in F sharp and my track is in F. So I'm just going to pull that transposition down one semitone, and now we're in F, or close to it. Perfect. So that's just it for the tom. Keep it simple, catchy, and let's move on to the hi-hats. So I have this sharp, punchy one and this lighter, airy kind of hat. So this lighter hat is going to be kind of complementary to the punch of this hat. So we want a nice punchy hat so that it punches through the mix, but it's very short. And this one, it's softer and it kind of just carries that hat just a little bit more. So it's not just a sharp punch and that's it. It has a little bit of a nice texture to that hat. I'll go into the MIDI here and I'm just going to add very simple, but I want to add some movement to this. Just go into each of these sounds and just slightly offset each one of them. Just add a little bit of groove and swing. Maybe a little bit more. Nice, makes it just feel not so robotic and repetitive. So now that I have 2 layers of hats, I want one to be in the middle of the mix and one to be a bit wider. So I'll go into the drum rack again. And so for the sharp punchy hat, I'm going to leave that in the center of the mix. But the light airy hat, I want to push that out so it's a bit wider. So I'm going to use this plugin called Wider. And I'm going to throw that only on the light airy hat. This is actually a free plugin. It's awesome. I use it all the time now instead of using the Haas effect. I find that it works a lot better. So check out this plugin. I can even put a link to it in the description below so you can check that out and get it completely free. So then as I push this up, you'll hear it get nice and wide. Beautiful. And now I have a punchy centered hat and a nice wide airy hat. So we get best of both. Throw an EQ on the end of the chain and just cut out some of the low frequencies we don't need. Awesome. I am going to add a little bit of saturation as well onto this. I find that Orsen definitely has some nice crispy, crunchy hats. And now that I've pushed that up, it's a little bit shrill. So I'm just going to take out some of the shrill, harsh frequencies. There we go. Moving on to the clap. So I have 2 claps here. I have body and I have high. The high obviously is higher sounding frequencies and the body is kind of that lower crunch that I want from the clap. So listening together, you can see very simple MIDI as usual. And I'll just take a listen to both and together. Maybe I'll add just a little bit of saturation to these as well, but it'll kind of glue them together, make them feel a bit more aggressive. And some EQ. And that tail end I kind of like, this tail end right here. Because it kind of feels like it goes wah, wah, and it kind of adds a little bit of nice groove. Subtle, but it's nice. Now I'm moving on to my shakers. I have 2 here. They sound very similar, but they're just slightly different. And this makes it more cohesive because then you're not grabbing too many different elements for the shakers. It feels more realistic, like you're holding one shaker or one tambourine or an instrument and you're playing it and it sounds more humanized because it is the same sort of shaker, just played differently. I have them just panned a little bit to the right because they are panned hard to the left. So I'm going to push this one a little bit to the right. So I have one to the left and one to the right. And then I'm going to go into the MIDI. And then I'm going to just draw out 16ths here. But I want to change this up a little bit. I don't want it to be the same velocity the whole time. So I'm just going to just draw like this. So it's a little bit different. And then I'll duplicate that over a few times. It's pretty stagnant sounding right now, but I'm going to add some sidechain compression after to make it feel like it's flowing. But right now I just want to grab some of these notes here. Just randomly. And I'm going to pull them down. So now I have some playing on the higher, more harder hitting one, and some I have hitting on the softer hitting shaker. And maybe I'll duplicate these over so they're playing on both. But these ones I will turn down quite a bit. Still sounds stagnant. Let's grab a compressor and throw that on and sidechain to the kick drum. And let's get that nice flowing groove going. And that sounds pretty good. Let's take a listen with the clap and the hats and the percussion and the kick so far. Maybe I'll turn the hats up, the shakers up a little bit. And the clap up a little bit. Sounds good. It sounds like it's grooving already. Let's keep going on with the rest of the drums. So I have this tambourine. This is going to add a nice flow to the sound. I have it on each of these eighth notes here. So eighth notes going all the way across. And I'll just slightly alter the velocity again. I'm just holding and drawing across. And by doing that, I'm just using the human touch to kind of, make some errors here. You can see that they're just slightly different. If I just try with my mouse to try and draw a straight line, it's going to be a little bit off. And that's what I want. I want that humanized feeling of the tambourine. But I'm going to just have it hit a little bit softer by just taking away the initial transient and pushing up the fade in a little bit. So it's not hitting it so hard. It doesn't have such a hard transient. And let's take a listen to that. Same deal with the compression. I'll duplicate the compressor from the shakers onto the tambourine. So it's following the groove of the kick. It's pumping with the kick. And I'll add just a little bit of reverb onto that. And turn up the volume a little bit. Maybe a little bit more decay time. And some EQ. Roll off a little bit of the high end. And I can actually use that wider again because this is a really nice, like, airy type sound. I want that really far out in the sides of the mix. So actually, I'm going to add some more stuff here. I'm going to add an auto pan onto this sound, just to give it a little bit of movement back and forth. And then I'm going to actually make this more of a crispy sounding tambourine. So I'm going to add a vocoder, and I'm going to pull the dry wet down because right away it's going to sound really white noise-y. So I'll just bring this dry wet down a little bit. And this is just really going to fill up that high end. Let me roll off a little bit. And turn up the volume a little bit. And maybe a little bit of the low end I can take out as well. And then we have this kind of washy tambourine white noise. I'll pull the dry wet down a little bit more. And that sounds pretty good. It's going to give us that nice floaty kind of top end that's going to fill up some of the empty space and not feel so cut and dry. Last, I have two percussion elements. Very simple, just a clap. It's actually a snare, and it's just on one of the offbeats here, just kind of on an upbeat. And by placing it on this upbeat where the groove kind of comes up, it's making it feel kind of more groovy as well because it hits on a place that you're coming up while you're kind of bobbing. So I play it with the metronome. So that adds a little bit more extra groove. And then the last is this off percussion. So these Percs, just a couple different random hits, like a tabla, and then a perc like this. And they're just very quietly in the background. I can add some reverb onto there. And some EQ to roll off that low end. Perfect. Super simple, just a couple extra hits to keep the groove interesting. The last thing that I have here is probably what I should have showed first because it's actually really cool, but it's this percussion loop. I don't remember exactly how I made it, but it sounds really nice and it fills up a lot of that empty space, just like those shakers do. So let's listen before and after with this new percussive loop. And I'll turn the kick on as well. And I'll put a little bit more reverb on that tambourine. And now listen with the percussion loop. Turn up a little bit more. So it adds such a nice, subtle texture of just swing and groove. I highly recommend grabbing some loops like this. Just ones that, from loop packs that have just some kind of interesting, weird textural sounds, some grainy type sounds, or just like percussion loops. There's a lot of processing going on, or a lot of thought going into a lot of these loops that makes it very groovy and swingy. And sometimes it's just what you need to kind of bring your track to the next level, something you might not have thought of, but just by grabbing a loop and throwing it in and messing with the EQ and some effects, you can create these really cool loops that actually complement your track. I think I want to add a little bit more to this bass, maybe a second note here. And much quieter. So let's go. Yeah, like that. Let's take a listen again. It's sounding really good so far. Let's move on to the synths next. First thing I usually do is grab a pad or a string instrument to kind of just keep the pitch of the track and kind of set a tone or a vibe. So I'll grab wavetable, throw that on the saw pad here, and I'm just going to play out Sawtooth. Pull the filter down a little bit, push this to 24, and I want to push up the unison quite a bit. Let's go 5 or 6 voices. And I'll push on the second oscillator here, push that up an octave. The detune, go up or down 2. And then on the other oscillator, go down the opposite. So detune by a couple cents one way, and then the other octave by the other way. And I'll push this up to close to a sawtooth as well. A little bit of attack, a little bit of release, full sustain, and then I want to filter out the low end as well. Next, I'll grab a reverb just to soften up this sound a little bit. Whoop. Sounds good. And I'm going to go in and draw an F minor chord. So F, the G sharp or A flat, and then the C. That's going to be F minor. And I'm going to duplicate this F an octave higher, and I'll push up this G an octave higher as well. This G sharp, rather. Just inverting some of those notes to give it a little bit more presence in the high end. And with an EQ, I'm going to cut out that low end and really push up the high end. Maybe some chorus on there, get some movement. A little less. Awesome, sounds good. Next, I have this, what I call the gritty top. And this is something that it kind of muddies up the mix. So I'm not entirely sure if I want to keep it in the final track, but it is a really cool sound. And it's something that I thought would be a good addition to this track. So in a lot of Orsen stuff, he has these really moving types of plucks and sawtooth type synths, and they really fill up the kind of low mid to high mid section. But I also added this lead that I think sounds really cool. So I'll show you both. The sound is going to be wavetable. I'm going to design it from scratch here. So I'm going to change this to 24, turn this one on. I'm going to change the filter from clean to PRD. And that's going to give me these drive parameters here. Pull this down a little bit and pull this one up a little bit. And I'm going to take the MIDI from the bass. So the bass top here, I'm going to place that on the gritty top. It's going to follow the same pattern. It just makes sense to follow that bass, kind of complement it. Let's take a listen to how it sounds. Push this up to a sawtooth. Now we can hear it. Let's go a little higher. And I'm going to go to envelope 2, push the sustain up on the amp, but envelope 2, I'm going to pull this attack up a little bit and make it like kind of sharper on the attack here. Go into the matrix, and I'm going to push this up on my frequency. 2. Okay, and I'm going to change this actually to collection, and I'm going to go to violet here. I'm going to push up the drive. Yeah, a nice like waspy kind of gritty sawtooth sound. Let's add some unison onto here. Maybe a bit more decay. Okay, and let me EQ out some extra low end here. I'll add a saturator, maybe some delay, and some reverb. Turn these off for now. Let's turn the saturation up. And I can already see I'm getting a lot of low end I don't need. Maybe a little bit of high end off. And I'm going to duplicate that EQ after the saturator because the saturator can add some extra frequencies and harmonics that are going to come back in. So if I actually turn this off, you can see the low end is coming up louder than it was before. Cut that out. Adding a little bit of delay. And some reverb. And actually, I'm going to take out some of that high end because I do want that lead sound to come through. There we go. Now I have this kind of cool gritty top sound. Let's take a listen with the rest of the instruments so far. Sounding pretty good. Let's go on to the lead sounds. There's two lead sounds. There's a low layer and a high layer, and they're interplaying really well together. So I have the low lead. It's just going to be very simple, a pluck. So sawtooth, pull the frequency down, change this to 24, go into the envelope 2, bring the sustain down, matrix, filter frequency 1, and turn this into a pluck. What I do have at the beginning is going to be an arpeggiator, converge and diverge. And it's going to sound like this with this MIDI chord structure. I'm going to change that to 16ths. And I'll open up this a little bit more. I'll keep the filter at 12 here to let a little bit more of that high end kind of get through. Add a reverb and a delay, and then I'll take a little bit closer look at the MIDI section. Just a little bit of delay because I'm gonna have so many plucks coming through with that fast arp. A little bit of pre-delay, make room for those hits. And looking at the actual chord structure here, so I just have that F minor chord, and then some variation with an octave here, then the D sharp, just going up the minor scale. And what I did is I actually just played this out as a minor chord and just made some adjustments. So I changed this to the high note here so that you can have, you know, that break. And if I pull this here, it plays back down. It goes up and then be-do-do goes back down. I don't like that as much. It doesn't sound as groovy to me, so I pulled this out so that it's just jumping between the bottom and the high note here. It just sounds better to me. And I could even close this off as well so that there's no note there. Or that it plays just the high note, but I like the low note there. And then I did some other variations here as well. All the MIDI comes with the project files that you can download in the description, so don't worry if you can't write this all down or you're not sure about the melodies. Maybe a little bit of saturation onto there, just a tiny bit. And let's move on to the final lead. For this last one, I actually used one of Ableton's presets. So anger management, and this one sounds really cool. Just right off the bat, I'm using the same MIDI. It's a really cool sound, but I add an arpeggiator onto it. And I'll pull the resonance down. And I change this from this really gritty sound to a just a sine wave. Pull down the drive quite a bit. push oscillator 2 also to just a basic shape, and then sine wave. There's so much modulation here that it's a really cool sound off as well. So going into the arpeggiator, I'm going to go style, converge, and diverge again, but I'm going to add a step onto the arpeggiator and change the rate to 16ths so that it plays like this. It goes up that extra step and gives you that extra octave. Pull the drive down a little bit and push the volume up a bit. Maybe a little bit less volume in this second octave. And now for some effects to make this sound really nice and full. So some EQ, delay, and a reverb. I'm just going to adjust this frequency here to get more of a wafting feel. Let's listen how important these layers are. So if I just gonna go ahead and EQ out some of that low end of that lead sound. But listening to this lead sound, they both are similar, both on their own are powerful, but together they create this really kind of wide, open mix of sounds, and it just creates a much more professional style of lead. It's not just one single instrument, it's two combining to make one instrument that sounds way better than just either of them on their own. Combined with that gritty top. And then that gritty top is just there to give just a little bit of grit to that low mid section and just push it forward a little bit. So your mind is always listening for something that is even quieter in the background of the song. It's just subconsciously more interesting, and it makes the listener feel more engaged, even if they don't know why. So let me just add one last thing to the sound, which is going to be the glue compressor and the saturator. So this is going to push up the volume of the drums a little bit. Push this before. And then the glue compressor. We are clipping a little bit, so I'm just going to just compress these here and then turn up the volume over here a little bit and turn the soft clipping on so that we're not getting any hard clipping here. I'm gonna turn the kick up a few more decibels, and this is how it sounds all together. The kick is feeling like it's a little bit lost in the mix, so I'm going to turn down the bass by 2 decibels, the drums by maybe 2 decibels, and the synths by 2 decibels. And that way the kick will be louder because everything else is quieter. Let's take a listen to all the instruments now one last time. Make sure to download the project files in the link in the description below. And if you want to learn how to make more music like this, subscribe and check out one of these 2 videos right here.